thank you for coming to this Wonkcomms event on teams and skill sets. And thank you to Chatham House for hosting it. And actually to all of the gracious hosts of all of the Wonkcomms events we've had this year. This is the fourth Wonkcomms event this year. And this one specifically on teams and skill sets. So let's kick off with some of the things that we've always said at Wonkcomms events, some of the housekeeping. Please ensure your mobile phones are switched on and set to Wonkcomms, the hashtag. We want as much second screen action as possible. The event, we may be in Chatham House, but this event isn't under the Chatham House rules. It's in fact has been streamed live online, so anyone could be listening in. It's also being recorded for posterity. So in the Q&A, if you can wait until someone comes with a microphone to speak so that people online can listen in. And I think those are, I don't know about fire exits and toilets, but if there's a fire, don't panic. Okay, so Wonkcomms. For those of you that don't know, Wonkcomms started up in April with an event held at my organisation, ODI, looking at the future of think tank communications. We've talked about media, about the role of research and the research communications divide, or how to bridge that research communications divide. We've talked about a range of different things, but what we haven't really focused on is the who, the people, the teams, the skill sets. And I think that's a really big question, and it's a question that affects us all. There are lots of different models of communication staffing. There's loads of different skill sets that you might need to effectively run a future-ready think tank communications team. How do you do that? We're going to have 4 different views on different aspects of think tank communications teams, think tank communication skills. We've got Keith Burnet from Chatham House, the Director of Communications and Publishing, who will start to kick us off with an overview of Chatham House's operation, but also a view on how communications has changed over the last period in think tanks. Moving on to Carys Afoko, who is from the New Economics Foundation, NEF, and will give us some perspectives from a small team of think tank communicators. Hello, guys. Then we move to the States, to Joe, who is either side of me, and who will take us through some of the ways in which he's staffed his team at the Century Foundation. And finally, we will get an external view from Tom Nixon, who's at Nixon McInnes. So I think lots of different views for us to go through today, hopefully lots of points for discussion. I'm going to try and keep everyone to 10 minutes in terms of their presentation so that we can have as much discussion as possible at the end. And yes, there'll be a sort of full Q&A at the end. So without further ado, moving on to Keith.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone. Welcome to Chatham House. I think the Wonkcomms initiative is a really good one, so I'm really pleased that we're taking part. And what I'm going to do is give you an outline of what Chatham House does, very briefly. Then I'll go into a little bit more detail about the communications and publishing team here. And then I'll sort of finish up with some of the things that I think or I see would be as important for sort of skill sets for people in comms today. So, as I said, I'll start with Chatham House. I'm not sure how much you know about us, but we are an international affairs think tank. We don't do foreign policy, i.e. we're not working sort of in the best interests of the UK or the UK government. It's a much more global outreach. But that doesn't mean we don't work with government departments, DFID and the Foreign Office and so on. But the mission is quite a bold one, to build a more prosperous and secure world. We do that through two main activities. Facilitating dialogue, that's having discussions here and elsewhere around the world. We publish research, and in a sense these are the two activities that we've that we've done since day one, since 1920. At the moment, we have about 120 staff based here, and we have part of the building next door, or actually the building up above, because we're in the basement of the building next door, not in Chatham House itself. We have about 120 associate fellows who are based in based in about 20 countries. Our reputation is really important to us. In the annual think tank survey from the University of Pennsylvania, the last 2 years we've been ranked number 2 in the world, behind Brookings, and number 1 sort of non-US for the last 5 years. That is important to us. It's kind of what our research is based on, our reputation. The structure of the organisation, we have 4 research departments, area studies, international law, and so on. They're the ones in the pink. And then we have 3 support departments, including communications and publishing. External relations is not perhaps what you might think. It's not the sort of traditional ER, but it's more looking after membership and fundraising. The communications and publishing department itself is organised into 5 areas. I won't be touching on the bottom 2 today, the International Affairs Journal and the World Today magazine. Really more the top 3, publishing online, website and digital, and the outreach. I guess I'm here to describe Chatham House, or to go over Chatham House as a sort of dedicated large comms team. And we've got 15 full-time and 3 part-time staff, which maybe to some of you sounds quite large, but I suppose our competitors are Council on Foreign Relations and Brookings, and I was looking at Council on Foreign Relations website today, and they have 46 comms staff. So it's I guess it's all relative. On the publishing and online content areas, I guess these are the main areas that we cover. So it's strategy and planning and management of the output. The brand and the logo sits here, and we do the more traditional stuff here, the editorial. And you notice down at the bottom, it's social media as well sits here. And I suppose that's because our social media is more content-led. It's not strictly push communications. It's more about tone and timing. And I'll come on and maybe explain that a little bit more in a minute or two. The second area is a website and digital, and that's more technical now. It used to be where we did all the editing, but it's now much more a technical function. We're in the middle of a major redevelopment of the website at the moment, and it should be finished around about March or April, and as I said, that's more technical driven. The outreach is probably more traditionally what you might expect, which is mostly government relations and media relations. We reach out sort of centrally to Whitehall, Brussels, and a little bit to Washington. But that doesn't mean that the research teams themselves don't do their own outreach. And so the Africa program has got lots of relations across the continent and in capitals there. And our role is to sort of fill the gaps, mostly in the UK and Brussels, but also to help them if they need it. Within the 3 sections that I described, these are the positions that we have. And you'll see that some of the roles, the editor and I guess the producer, they're very task specific, and that's in a way what there has been, and perhaps in some what it will be. But other roles, like the editorial project coordinator and the media government relations officer, they cut across a lot of areas, particularly on the editorial and project side. So that's where the person is responsible for photography, for branding, for commissioning articles, or commissioning expert comments, as well as some elements of social media. And when I spoke to Nick a few weeks ago, so one of the questions we asked was, how do we help deliver the mission? I'm not sure it's overly relevant to explain, but we have a mission, we have a strategic plan that the directors feed into, then we have departmental and individual objectives, and then we there are always discussions and planning meetings, away days. But I guess the key point here is that the comms role is, the way I see it, is to provide a strong platform for the rest of the organization. We need to have a good tone. We need to know when it's appropriate to push. We don't, in a sense, chase the news. It might seem strange to some of you, but if we release a report, it might not always be the best thing to have a lot of coverage. The report might actually be aimed at some policymakers, not just in the UK, but overseas. So I don't know how usual or how common that is for the rest of you, but for us, it's very much gauged on the main audience of the output, and it isn't always, obviously, media. Skill sets for the future. I've broken it down in terms of goal-specific and the multitask, as I described earlier. And I think that what we've seen in the last few years is a sort of emerging in some cases of some of the roles, and I think that that will continue. I think as some of the roles, as I described, as they get bigger, it might very well be that we separate and we have someone who's specifically going to focus on social media. But at the moment, and I think it's more with the new roles that we create, we definitely need people who can multitask. The same with the functions. The different functions definitely overlap. And I suppose one example might be when we commission our own blogs, our expert comments, and sometimes it could be a blog, sometimes we try and pitch it to a newspaper as an op-ed. And the teams obviously have to liaise, have to communicate internally and make sure that we're getting the right content to the right audience. There's definitely a lot more overlap within the functions. Digital, I mean, obviously digital is becoming more mainstream, but I think that the key thing for us in the future is going to be how the research staff adapt themselves to digital. Some will do it well. Some will want to be involved and involved in the process and making the research available in different formats. Some don't, and I guess our role is to accommodate that. In terms of experience and skills, I suppose what I think we need more often is one core area of expertise and then interest or a willingness to sort of adapt and adopt more skills. And again, one of the questions that you were trying to answer when I spoke to Nick is how best to prepare. And I guess for people who are starting out, maybe first or second job, and I asked my colleagues on this, and I think that what we thought was that we need people should probably go back to basics a bit. And the basic skills that we still need and can be useful across all comms functions would be editing skills, copying and proofing. If you can write and edit and amend and turn your own work around quickly, that's always going to be a benefit in any comms role. I think people who have a good, sound technical knowledge, and by that I mean learning HTML, being aware of what happens when you put content online, knowing how Google works. I think all these things are important and will continue to be important. One of my colleagues said that you need a good telephone manner. You need to be confident, and I agree. When you speak to journalists, you need to know how to sell and when to sell. You need to know when to pitch and when to leave it. I would also say that you need to be across as much as possible now, but don't be a slave to anything. Don't feel that you've got to have a focus on social media and that's everything. And don't try and be all things to all people. You've got to know when to move in, when not to. I think 10 minutes have passed, so these are my observations. I hope they're helpful. Happy to chat about them in the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can you sit down now?
Yeah, we'll come back after Joe, when Joe's done his presentation, we'll do that. Okay, next up is Carys Afoko, who's been working in comms for 6 years and Wonkcomms for 2, she tells me. She's at NEF. I don't know if anyone saw yesterday, NEF released the George Osborne Bingo. I'm desperate to know, because I didn't get a chance to play along, was there a full house at the end?
There was a full house, yeah.
Yes.
There was not a prize for the bingo, though, which none of our social media followers spotted, so we got away with that one. Hi, everyone. I'm feeling a bit low-tech because I haven't done a PowerPoint like Keith did, so slightly conscious that with the big screen, it's going to look a bit blank, so you just have to kind of blank out the Chatham House. I'm Carys. I work at the New Economics Foundation, and I'm going to talk to you really briefly about generalists and being a comms generalist, partly because I'm a comms generalist. I started out doing press for a Labour politician, Burnet, then went to a corporate PR and public affairs agency, and now work at NEF. And I guess in all my roles, I've had to be a generalist, so I've got a bit of a bias, because I've never really had a role where I didn't have to do a bit of everything, and never worked in an organisation where people suddenly went, oh, could you run the Twitter feed for this? Or, oh, I need a press release for this thing. So I'll admit a bias, but I also think there's quite a strong case for communications professionals, whether they're in Wonkland or otherwise, to be able to be generalists and to have jobs that allow them to be generalists. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the New Economics Foundation first, then I'll talk about the team that I work in, and then I'll talk about what I think that means for skills and for people coming into the sector. So does everyone know NEF? Everyone who heard of NEF? I'll give you a kind of short synopsis and tell you a bit more about sort of how we're structured. So we're an economics and social research think and do tank. Anyone else from a think and do tank? Personally, even though this isn't Chatham House, there's a phrase I hate, but because I think it means even less to people than think tank does. But what it means in our case is that alongside doing research and a kind of standard, not quite academic grade reports, we also work with a lot of community groups, work with a lot of practitioners. So for example, in our criminal justice work, a lot of the work we do is, as well as geared towards researchers, is with magistrates, with probation officers. And it also means we have a whole team at the moment dedicated to engaging with campaigners and activists, because a lot of our work overlaps with people who are campaigning and working on different issues. So that's the sort of do bit of our think tank. Think and do tank. Then the other thing you need to know about NEF is that we do a hell of a lot of different types of research. I'm sure there are other people from think tanks that work across a broad range of issues. I occasionally kind of sit up at night and wish I worked at Resolution Foundation or somewhere with a really clear mission. But so just to give you a bit of an idea about NEF, we cover macroeconomics, banking reform, sort of different areas of finance and monetary policy. We also work on fishing and sort of sustainable environmental policy. So at the moment we're working on the European Common Fisheries Policy. We do work on poverty and inequality, so social exclusion, economic inequality. We work in criminal justice. We do some work on transport and infrastructure. So in the last year that's meant high-speed rail. Before that it was the third runway. And I'm missing out teams. We work on a lot of different issues, and even for someone who came from an agency and is a career generalist, it means that it forces you into a certain position, which is, I'm never going to know individual journalists or individual policymakers in the way that someone that works at a single issue NGO or think tank does. We're just never going to be able to get that depth of relationship. So again, it forces you to be a generalist and forces you to kind of have general skills that will mean you can generally speak to most journalists or policymakers and have an idea of what they like. And then the last thing you need to know about NEF is that apart from my team being quite small, we're small relative to the number of researchers. I don't know how many people are at Chatham House in total.
It's 120 staff, about 120 external researchers, and then 70 internal researchers.
Okay, well, maybe your ratio is about the same as ours, but there's 3 of us in the comms team, and there's about 50 to 60 staff members at NEF, and then we've probably got about 10 or 12 fellows or associated people that aren't in the office every day. So, well, as I say frequently, it might not be the case. We're kind of small as a team, there's only 3 of us, and we're small relative to the size of our organisation, so the sort of researcher to comms person ratio is pretty, I'd say pretty stacked against us. So there's a lot of people generating content and not many people whose job it is to put it out. So that's NEF, and that's why NEF has to be, our comms team has to be quite generalist. But now I'm going to talk about the comms team and why I think it's a good thing that we're generalists. So there's 3 of us, myself, an incredibly talented communications officer called Ross, and an incredibly talented communications officer called Jessie, both of whom are back at the office, and I feel slightly guilty about that. And they're both called communications officers for a reason. When I joined the team, we had a publications officer and a communications officer. That didn't work, aside from the fact that probably for all of you, printed publications are dying. It just didn't work to have people siloed off when there are so few people that can muck in. So there are 3 of us. We all do a bit of everything, but we also all lead on one thing. So everyone can speak to a journalist. Everyone can, some more than others. I'm pretty slow with our CMS. Everyone can post a blog or tweet. Everyone can work with designers and printers and suppliers to get a report out the door. But in terms of how we split it, I lead on press, Ross leads on online and social media, and Jessie leads on kind of editorial and publications. And I guess that's the first thing I'd say about a small team. You really have to go with the strengths and enthusiasm of people in your team. You don't have the option of recruiting extra people in, and you kind of just have to go with people's passions and what they're good at. So Ross, who designed the George Osborne bingo sheet, has some developing skills, which was one of the reasons he was hired in, but also really likes design and messing around in design. So he knocked up the George Osborne bingo sheet. We produce quite a lot of Facebook graphics, and most of the time he does that. And Jessie loves writing and has a really good eye for design, so she does a lot of that kind of work. And then I pick up media because I quite like it and because it's the thing that's left. What else do you need to know about them? So we all have different backgrounds. I came from an agency, Jessie came from a sort of quite publications-focused agency, Ross used to work in the NHS. And I guess what we've all got in common is that we're all strong writers, we're all strong editors, and which is just kind of a bit of luck, really. We're all under 30, so basically social media and digital communications have been around as long as we've been working, and I guess it hasn't really been an option to know about them or get them or not. So I think that's something that we're kind of a bit lucky on, but is another important thing about generalists. I'm sure other people will talk about this in a more articulate way, but I don't see the future of digital as siloed at all. It has to be mainstreamed within a team. And we're lucky because we've got a bit of a head start on that, but I also think that's pretty important and something you should do anyway. What are the final things I wanted to say? Where we want to get to, and where we aren't quite yet in an organisation where there's quite a lot of researchers and not many people in comms, is to try and shift some of the burden of what needs to be done onto researchers so that we can be generating more content ourselves. A lot of what we do is online. We have quite a large and engaged supporter base, so 30,000 Twitter followers, 15,000 Facebook fans, 1,500 people that give us money by direct debit every month, which makes us quite unique among think tanks or think and do tanks. So it's really important to us that we maintain that supporter base and try and grow it, which means often creating content that our supporters might want, but that a funder might not have given us money to produce a whole report on. So in order to free up our team resource, that's about turning researchers into comms professionals as much as humanly possible. I'd be interested to hear how possible people think that is here. So we use as many researchers that are keen to. We use their personal Twitter feeds and retweet them so that we're curating content rather than just generating it. Researchers write almost all of the blog content, and we kind of train them up and try to teach them about what types of blogs work, the need to not footnote blogs, various things like that. And then in return, with the bits of time that we free up, we get to do things like, and if I'd have brought a PowerPoint, I could have showed you them, but you'll have to just look up our Facebook page after this. Facebook graphics, which we do quite a lot of now, the kind of square, one fact, one number, one picture of George Osborne's face yesterday, summing up an idea or something that we're keen on, and that's a really sort of good, impactful way for us to communicate with people outside of Wonkcomms, which is quite a big part of NEF's mission in terms of our comms. So yeah, so that's kind of where we need to head to. And in order to do it in a small team, you have to find other people in the organisation that can start doing bits of your job. But I also think that there's a strong case for people being generalists. I think the direction of travel for communications, and probably for researchers and people in other roles, is that you need to be able to be on top of everything. You need to be able to do a bit of everything. And we're just lucky in our team that we're forced to do that, because when someone was on holiday, as they were on Monday, and someone else was sick, I had to man the Twitter feed and speak to some journalists and update the blog and speak to printers and designers. So we're kind of forced into it, but I think there are a lot of strengths to that approach. So, to wrap up, I think I've had 10 minutes almost. What does that mean for hiring? So we're actually going to be having a fourth member of the team in the new year, which I'm very excited about. Someone else to tweet when people are sick and on holiday. And so I've been thinking quite a lot about the skills that we need and what it is that makes a comms professional that needs to come and work in a think tank. I think where I've got to is, well, I've written it down here, media junkie. I think that's really, really important. Even though fewer and fewer people are reading printed papers, you've got to have an appetite for media and a desire to consume media to be able to put yourself in a journalist's shoes, in a blogger's shoes, in the shoes of anyone that you want to make contact with. And so I think someone who's got a passion for consuming different types of content and different types of media is really, really important. Excellent writer and editor. Yeah, I think that's probably just a skill, a sort of bread and butter, old-fashioned skill that people have had to have for decades in comms. I just think it's not going to go away, especially in think tank comms. Like, most of your job is being a translator. Taking occasionally, I think our longest sentence, we have a competition in the team for people who found the longest sentence. I think 100 words is our longest this year. Taking the 100-word sentence and turning it into something sensible and then explaining to the researcher why the 100-word sentence is now better as a series of shorter sentences. So yeah, that writing and editing I think is core for any comms job, and it's particularly core when you're working in a think tank. You need to be able to translate the brilliant and occasionally dense things that get churned out into really bite-sized content. And the last thing I've said is gets policy but isn't a researcher. So I've got two stories for that, because a year ago I was recruiting for Jessie, who's the third member of our team. And yeah, I guess there's a special type of person that can work in a think tank that sits halfway between policy and halfway between getting policy, but isn't quite a researcher. So I'll talk about two people I interviewed to try and explain that. One was a really talented girl from a PR agency, and one of the exercises we set was we do a daily press digest for researchers in NEF with a kind of, here are some headlines you need to know about. So as an exercise, we kind of said, you know a bit about NEF, sit down, do a daily paper digest. The first story she put down was the royal wedding. And as much as I liked her and as intelligent as she was, she just hadn't got what we were about. So a bit of an extreme case, but someone has to kind of get policy and get the policy environment. It isn't enough to just be a talented comms person that could go and work for kind of Boots or Coca-Cola, or, you need to sort of get policy and be interested in politics. And I guess the second is that we also interviewed a lot of people who, because NEF's quite a popular place to work at, clearly wanted to be researchers. And I think that doesn't really work either, because apart from the fact no one really wants someone in their team who's always like, what are they doing over there? You have to have a bit of a short attention span, and you have to maintain the distance from the content that you're promoting. That's like, this actually isn't the most interesting thing in the world, and if I pick up the phone to a journalist, I have to think about what about it will be interesting to them. And I think that someone who's got a real passion for research and maybe is a bit of a wonk themselves and it's like, oh, this is brilliant, let's go down into all the detail and what's your methodology, ain't going to make a great comms person. I think people who don't want to read a 100-word sentence, who don't want to watch a YouTube video that's 10 minutes long and really boring, make good comms people, which is lucky for me because I've got a very short attention span. And I think that's all I'm going to say.
Okay, next up we have Joe via video link. Now, Joe, when I asked him to send me a bio, sent me 3. And they were, there was the plain one, and then the flippant one, and then the even more flippant one. So I'm to try and find a place in the middle that's kind of flippant, but also serious. I've taken some of the best bits. Joe is a digital media specialist who has had the seldom used power of bringing party conversations to a record-scratching halt by mentioning that he has a PhD in philosophy. where he once wrote about just war theory and ethics for audiences that numbered well into the double digits, he now knows all about content strategy, branding, and general wonkcommery. When he needs a challenge, he goes to his day job, where he attempts to convince a group of academics and old-school journalists that the PDF is not the platonic form of online content. And then the more serious bit. Before the Century Foundation, he was the chief web editor for the Congressional Budget Office, a staff writer at factcheck.org. And the fact I have about Joe is that he wrote what I reckon is about the best Wonkcomms job description I've ever seen. And as today we're talking about skills and people, I hope he doesn't mind me reading it out. Okay, so this is for blogger and social media specialist at the Century Foundation in New York. You are a bright, witty denizen of the online world. You're equally at home writing about Game of Thrones as economic policy. Sometimes you find yourself interrupting conversations to Instagram a great shot. When you go to parties, you introduce yourself by your Twitter handle and then lament to your friends that traditional media is 30 minutes behind and 50% less insightful than political commentary on social media. You have a passion for progressive public policy. You like working in a small team on which you can start implementing new ideas immediately. You know that new media calls for new marketing and community organizing techniques, but also get why it's still a good idea to read Ogilvy. You also know why a blogging social media job ad doesn't bother with a hypothetical Facebook scenario. So, Joe, kick us off from the States. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick, for the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. All right. So I'm pretty much at the opposite end of the spectrum from Keith. I've been with the Century Foundation only since February of this year, and the remaining 4 full-time members of our team have actually joined since then. So we've had some fairly long days around here as we all kind of try to come up to speed on think tanks and on working together. But this has also given us the luxury of being able to think holistically about what a modern Wonkcomms team would look like. So we ended up with kind of 3 big takeaways that I'd like to share here today. So first is to think in terms of functions, not in terms of roles. So many Wonkcomms teams have grown organically, adding specialists as new fields spring up. So we probably started with somebody who edited prepared reports for publication, the glory days of printed books, white papers, that sort of thing. We may have later added a couple of people to organize press conferences or otherwise attempt to convince journalists to write about our most recent white paper. Later on, we decided we needed one of those kind of newfangled websites, so we hired a webmaster and asked him or her to post all of our reports there. More recently, we may have decided that we needed someone who understands this whole social media thing, so we hired a social media specialist, and some who are way out on the cutting edge are now looking into the whole big data thing and looking for data visualization specialists. So it's the model that makes a lot of sense in historical context, but it's probably not the right way to think about a Wonkcomms team in 2013. So before we began our recent hiring spree at the Century Foundation, we sat down to think kind of systematically about what kinds of things we asked communications teams to do. So we essentially settled on 4 major areas: content, outreach, technology, and design. So your list may vary slightly, but I suspect that most of what we do can be mapped onto this model reasonably well. Of course, those aren't really distinct things. We can't exactly do outreach without some content. Content's more effective when it's designed in a compelling way. And we'll need the right technology to reach our audiences, some of which is to say that our major areas overlap significantly. And you have to forgive me here a little bit. As Nick mentioned, I was a philosopher before I went into Wonkcomms, and so I've not yet broken the habit of visualizing relationships with Venn diagrams. So I think somewhere maybe floating around there is the Venn diagram that we put together here that talks a bit about how our Wonkcomms team is visualized, but it doesn't, from what I can see on the screen, it may not be there, so you may just have to guess a little bit at what this actually looks like. But we have, I essentially a four-circle Venn diagram with sort of overlaps between our four major areas. And look, there it shows up by magic. Right, so you can kind of see how we have things organized a bit. So the philosopher Carys in me is going to make myself stop and point out that this isn't really a proper four-circle Venn diagram that needs to have overlaps between every group of 2, 3, and 4. So that's pretty complicated, and this I think does the job. So once we had kind of pulled together our big big areas and thought about the ways these things overlap, we began the process of determining our staffing. So one thing you might notice here is that many of the specific jobs for which we've traditionally hired specialists, so like social media or event planning or media relations, really cover only very specific subsets of responsibilities. So since we, like Carys, can't really afford to hire a specialist to cover every single area on the chart, we looked also for some generalists. So we decided that we could hire 4 positions in addition to mine, provided that we were willing to staff them at a relatively junior level. So this meant that we ended up hiring 1 person for each of the 4 areas. A content specialist, this is the ad that Nick read to you a few minutes ago. Our content specialist runs our blog, our social media account, handles analytics for our online properties, and so forth. We have an outreach specialist who engages in traditional media relations work, but she also takes the lead on the content side of our customer relations management software, and plays a big role in our event planning efforts. We have a visual design specialist who serves as our art director and graphic designer and handles kind of all aspects of our visual design, from print to just general visual brand management. And we have a technology specialist who's our lead web developer, app developer, and customizes our CRM and other business intelligence products. And then I work kind of in the middle overlapping areas with the flexibility to step into the outer sections in a pinch. So I should say that my entire team cringes a little bit every time I say that last part. So what we needed were people who are accustomed to working in integrated teams with whose members have really overlapping skill sets. And because the Century Foundation covers a really wide variety of topics, so we do foreign policy here, but also economics, healthcare, income inequality, labor, education. So we're kind of all over the place. So we needed a team with the flexibility to switch between projects that often have very different goals and very different audiences. And finally, because because we don't, like most of you, we have a limited budget, we needed people who could do all these things while still being relatively early in their career. So we asked ourselves, where can you find this particular combination of skills? And the answer turns out to be PR agencies, specifically small agencies. So they tend to work in teams. They bring together folks from with lots of different areas who then kind of combine to create projects. And even more importantly, they're accustomed to working with multiple clients who are often in entirely different industries. So they're accustomed to switching between projects. Right? And because we were looking for people from relatively small agencies, we were looking at agencies that can't really afford to bury their young staff in narrow specialties. Right? So that was kind of our second point, which was that when we were looking at staffing, we reached outside of the traditional, what you might think of as the traditional Wonkcomms space. So finally, the third point that I would like to hit, or at least that we've looked at, was to remember who it was that we were trying to recruit. So we were going after people who had agency backgrounds. So these were people who already had jobs working out of a loft in Greenwich Village, complete with a billiards table in the lobby, pour-over coffee bar, colleagues with vintage eyewear, and so forth. We, on the other hand, had a lot of middle-aged academics who think the kids are still listening to Britney Spears and who really never met a suit that was too big. When we started looking around then at Wonkcomms job ads from other think tanks, thinking that we'll sort of poach some of the best ads out there, they often seem to be targeted more at the way that the lump academics than at the young creative types. So I realize these are terrible stereotypes and not really fair. In fact, most of our folks here in the office in New York are research folks who are better dressed than I am, but nonetheless, we did have this sort of perceived image problem that we're trying to get people who are accustomed to working in much different environments to come into a think tank. What we do have, though, is really in some ways a lot of unique things to offer. So the first is, we can let you be in charge. We were recruiting junior staff and then offering to give them a pretty tremendous amount of freedom. So our, for instance, our art director here is a 22-year-old Winterkind, but for all of her prodigious talents, if she were out in a traditional agency setting, she'd be playing second or third or fourth fiddle to someone with more experience. Here at the Century Foundation, she gets to run the show. Second is that think tanks offer in some ways a really unique challenge. So there are a lot of people out there trying to present long-form, wonky content in a world that's increasingly dominated by short-form, easy-to-process content bites. It's probably safe to say that no one has really fully cracked this problem yet, and that we shouldn't underestimate the allure of offering people the opportunity to be the first to solve what is a really tough problem. And finally, there's we have to remember that millennials, whom we were going after, are idealists. And yes, I realize this is a gross overgeneralization, and just it in fact pains me to the very bottom of my cynical, alienated, disengaged Generation X heart to talk about idealists. But there are real, honest-to-God surveys out there that show that millennials are pretty invested in making the world a better place. Managing the blog for a nonprofit that's out to save the world might buy you at least a little bit of cred when you're hanging out with your vintage eyeglass-wearing peers. So we sat down with kind of all of these advantages that we do have in mind, and we wrote some ads. And as Nick mentioned, we put in a few Game of Thrones references here and there. And our response turned out to be pretty good. We had about 400 applicants for our content position, and another 250 or so for our outreach position. So we lured a couple of really extraordinarily talented 20-somethings away from creative agencies and promoted two equally talented interns, each of whom had some previous agency experience, and promoted them to full-time positions. So at the moment, we're still pretty early in our experiment. Like I said, our team finished coming together in November, so we're still very early. But we are pretty excited about some of the things that we already have on tap for 2014. So you'll have to probably check back this time next year to see whether this kind of grand experiment has been a success or gone down in flames. But I think that given the set of people that we have, I'm pretty confident that we can come back this time next year and tell you some pretty amazing things. So I'm going to close now. I think I'm close to my 20 minutes, or 10 minutes, so thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Last up is Tom. Tom Nixon from Nixon McInnes. He's a founder of Nixon McInnes, in fact, which is a digital consultancy that helps organizations create the right culture, structure, and strategies to enable them to thrive in a digitally interconnected or connected world. The reason Tom is here, we made contact through his colleague, Max St. John, who is involved in the government's Communication Network's Digital Capability Review, which was tasked with finding ways to improve government communications in the digital environment, released some really interesting videos and some interesting outcomes in terms of how digital how digital will affect the way government does communications. And I think he's here to help us ensure that we don't just talk to each other and to give us some perspectives from outside of the Wonkcomms world about how other organizations are dealing with communications change and learn from what they're doing right and wrong. So, Tom Nicholson.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I like to believe that they saved the best till last, but I think it's probably more down to the fact that I'm the oddball outsider of the lineup. So I'm not from the think tank world at all, although I have to say I'm a massive fan of the New Economics Foundation. And when you hear the politicians and the central bankers completely out of ideas, it's like the ideas are there, they've been written about, you just need to have the courage and the will to do it. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about economics. So my background is as an entrepreneur. I founded Nixon McInnes, as Nick said, 13 years ago, and it was founded on the idea of building more freedom and opportunity in the world. We're best known for our work in digital, so we help large organizations and bits of government with social media strategy to help them figure out how they can talk to people online through these new digital channels. And more recently, that started to evolve into what we call digital transformation, which is putting digital thinking at the heart of an entire business and making it digital in everything that it does. And what I'm really passionate about is doing business differently, so making business radically better. I believe that business and organizations of all types can be more democratic, they can be more open and decentralized, giving more power to people. And my company's been on the list of most democratic workplaces in the world for the last 5 years. So what I'm going to talk about briefly today is really just a few kind of trends and themes that hopefully will spark a few ideas, or maybe not useful at all, who knows. But yeah, loosely based around the way that we approach our work with clients, which is looking at culture, structure, and strategies. So starting off with culture, the number one theme that I think is most important in a culture is having an incredibly clear sense of purpose and values. How many people here have can really clearly articulate what the purpose of their organisation is? Wow, I thought it was going to be nearly everyone. That's amazing, only a few. And how many people could clearly articulate the set of core values that that organisation lives by? What drives its behaviour and how it makes decisions? Yeah, really not many at all. I think this is the single most important theme for any organisation today that wants to be relevant to people and make an impact in the world, having that clear sense of purpose and values. The next theme is about openness, and thanks to digital technology, the world has become an incredibly open place. And so we look at, for example, the Arab Spring uprisings, when digital media was being used, social media, to coordinate people protesting on the ground, as well as to get pictures out to the outside world. And so this theme of openness presents a whole load of opportunities to organisations, probably including yours as well. So thinking about how you can make the work that you do much more transparent to the outside world. And so I guess that translates as showing your workings as well as your outputs. I don't know if anyone's heard of the idea of open innovation. So this is a trend that's happening in business, and it's about inviting the world and other organisations and other people who are completely outside of your organisation into your process of innovating or researching or whatever it is that you do inside your organisation. I'll give you one quick example of that. A company called Gold Corp, who, as you might guess, go looking for gold, and they were looking for new locations where they could potentially find some gold. And the way that they approached it was they released all of their geological data into the public domain online, and then created a prize fund of $500,000 to say to people, can you help us analyse our data and see if you can recommend places that we dig? They received, I think it was about 100 locations to look at, about 80 of which found were successful and they found gold there. And the market capitalization of that organization increased from $100 million to $9 billion on the stock exchange. And so that was all through embracing this idea of openness. So you're not all chasing gold, or hopefully you're not all chasing gold, but seeing how you can think about making what you do more transparent and open with the outside world. So moving on to structure, the big trends that I've been seeing over the last 10 years that I've been working in this area is a move away from traditional structures, which are all based around silos, so things that sit in departments and individual areas of responsibility, and organizations that are based on hierarchies of control, so a boss and then a boss's boss. Moving from that to more networked models, where the lines are much more blurry inside organizations, and the connections to the outside world are much more blurry as well. And that ties back into this theme of openness, seeing openness happening on the inside of an organization. And so as part of this blurring of responsibilities, this idea that everyone's digital, so you don't just have digital in certain people's job titles. I think eventually that's actually going to be obsolete. We won't have digital marketing managers or digital press officers anymore. They'll just be communications people. And then another idea, which I think touches on a point that Carys raised, this idea of people who are in their 20s now, so Generation Y people who've grown up with the internet. They're actually now starting to provide mentoring to some of the older generation people inside their organizations. I heard for the first time the term reverse mentoring, which sounds a bit like having knowledge and experience kind of sucked out of your brain to me. But actually what they're saying is it's not about the mentor relationship between being someone old and experienced being the mentor and someone young receiving it, but actually the other way around, because I think it's the younger people who've grown up with this stuff who can't actually imagine a world where you have to get someone else's permission to be able to have your voice heard and to publish something, having those people mentoring the other people inside the organizations. And also as part of this, this move towards decentralization and more networked structures, the question about governance, like how do you keep some kind of degree of control over all of this stuff? And so really the best practice that we've seen is about just having really clear sets of principles and often just a simple set of flowcharts that you can follow so people know what they can and can't do. So a quick example of this is with Channel 4. So we did a piece of work with them where they suddenly discovered they had about 271 Facebook pages for all kinds of different shows and programs that had been on the channel. Loads of them were just being completely neglected, loads of them were getting spam on them and no one was looking after them, so they needed to rationalize them. And so the really simple solution to it is just this big flowchart that they now have at Channel 4 that tells them whether or not they need to set up a new Facebook page for a program they're working on. So for example, it will say, is this program a one-off show? And if it is, it will say, don't create a Facebook page because you know no one's going to update it afterwards. But the idea is once you create these kind of flowcharts and also create a set of principles to say, how do you behave in social spaces, you can then start to set everyone free and just say, just go for it, we trust you. Just make sure you stick to these loose guidelines. And then finally, strategy. So looking at a few themes. So co-creation, I've already mentioned. So I think a part of this blurring of roles and responsibilities is instead of having a research team that produce something and then it's the comms team job to push it out there, thinking how can we blend all of that stuff together? So how can the comms people be thinking a bit more like researchers and trying to get ideas and opinions and stuff coming into the organization, and getting the researchers to be a little bit more outward-facing and engaging as well. Often it requires different mindsets for both of those roles, but potentially the scope for producing much better work is huge when you can call upon all of the many thousands of people out there who might be interested in the things that you're researching. Real time is another strategy. So on the internet, everything's happening moment by moment. It doesn't follow the daily news cycle. And perhaps building on the idea that Carys had about producing much smaller, punchier pieces of output for social media, like a picture of George Osborne with kind of a pithy remark on it. But doing that stuff in real time, so actually, as he's talking, poking fun at him, taking something that he said, twisting his words a little bit, and then posting that out on the internet really fast. So that's real time. And then agile as well. This idea that projects in the old world used to have a very defined start, middle, and end, and the process was generally quite slow. But what we're seeing in lots of organizations now is that projects and programs develop in much faster iterations and cycles. So the way that might work with research is publishing insights much more as they're being gathered, and then gradually the research report gets built up over time. You know, and perhaps the biggest example of this, what do you think the biggest ever research project in the world, in the whole of world history, has been? I don't actually know the answer to this for sure. This is just my opinion, but this is why I'm asking you to guess. What would you hazard a guess that it is?
Wikipedia.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's Wikipedia, and that brings together a lot of these things that we're talking about. So it's co-creation. So it's you know, hundreds of thousands of people who've contributed to Wikipedia over the years. But it updates in real time. I don't know if any of you, for a laugh, have ever vandalized Wikipedia. I recommend try. Yeah, lots of you nodding your heads. So if you go onto a really controversial page, like a page about a religion, so go onto the page about like Islam or something like that, and just and then write something really controversial or delete something. They call it the heal time, like the speed at which it gets corrected and rolled back to what it was before. On those really busy pages, it often happens within seconds. So that real-timeness and that idea of co-creation is incredibly powerful. And then the final point that I want to leave you on, which I think combines lots of the themes that I've been talking about, is the idea now that everybody is in comms. Everyone inside an organisation. This is one of the things that came out of the government comms review that my colleague was involved in. And so what we're starting to see now is the really neat kind of Venn diagram, which really makes sense and provides a lot of structure. Actually, that's starting to kind of melt all into one big amorphous thing. And we're starting to see organisations now that are providing comms training, so media relations training, to all of their employees, because they realise that whether they like it or not, their employees are probably going to be on Facebook, they're probably going to be on Twitter increasingly, especially the Generation Y and the younger people. And so those people are going to be talking about work one way, whether you like it or not. So actually providing those people with some training as well is perhaps the best way to grow a comms function. So I think that's probably about it from me. But yeah, happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Joe, should we turn Joe around so that he can see the room? Is that okay, Joe?
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you all very much. I think probably the best thing to do is just throw the floor open for questions and see what comes up. Oh, sorry, yes, we need to, for the purposes of live streaming, we need to have mics. This one over here.
So I'm Claire Ainsley from Joseph Rowntree Foundation. I had a question for Tom, really, was just whether you could expand a bit more on that theme that you picked up around you're seeing models of structures moving more towards decentralized network models, and I was wondering if you could give an example of what that looks like.
Yeah, so one of the first, I think, building on the point that Keith made at the beginning, well, actually in his final slide, about the kinds of roles people have. So I call it a T-shaped person, which is someone who has like one main area of expertise, but then a really broad and deep set of skills in lots of different areas. So that's part of it, is people's roles not being like incredibly specific and specialised. Yes, people can have something that they major on, but having lots of skills in other areas as well. But really, what networks is all about is just breaking down the silos. So instead of saying, this is the comms team, this is the customer service team, you're starting to have roles that cross between functions as well. So to give you a really specific example of that, we see it a lot in organisations that have broken down the silos between customer service and communications. So for example, so we worked with Barclaycard, and if you were to tweet something saying, I really hate Barclaycard, it does happen, they've screwed me over. And someone from the Barclaycard team will pick that up, and it's someone who's trained in customer service, so they can actually fix your problem. They'll get in touch with you. They've got access to all of the systems, know how it all works. But they've had really comprehensive training from the comms team as well, because if they're replying back to you in a really public forum, you need to make sure that they don't A, break the law or any regulations, but also have the right tone of voice and just conduct themselves well in a really public arena. So I'd think of it, in terms of those two things. First of all, breaking down silos between departments as much as you can, and secondly, about broadening the skill sets of people so that everyone can be digital. It might not be the main thing they do in their job, but everyone is capable, if they need to, of responding to something on Twitter, for example.
Picking up on that, breaking down the silos, to what extent do you think in your organisations the research communication silo is coming down? I know that a couple of you mentioned the role of, well, you in particular mentioned having researchers applying for jobs. Obviously, we have the same problems too at ODI, and that's not necessarily what you want. But how much do you look for the researcher in the roles you are hiring for? To what extent do you kind of need that, and how much do you think the organisation is looking for the communications people in the researchers' roles?
So I don't look for researchers and people that we hire, because we've got a lot. But I think what we do try and do as a team is bring the comms person out of different researchers. So that's, equipping them to be on social media more, and I'm sure sort of everyone knows it's much more, we have a really great social media presence, but it's really powerful to have researchers who are at events, live tweeting from them, reacting to it on the statement as it happens. So I guess maybe it's a bit hypocritical, maybe I should be looking to hire researchers. But yeah, we try and bring the comms people, the inner comms people out of the researchers rather than the other way around. And mainly just because I think we've got enough researchers at NEF. We're pretty top heavy in terms of research heavy. We've got a lot of people with PhDs and masters and things, and what we need is people who've got an eye for detail, an eye for a news story, an understanding of what makes exciting content.
I think we've probably got space for both. So we do want to encourage, I don't want to say younger researchers, but we want to encourage researchers to be across so many different aspects or elements of their work. But we also have other research staff who are just supremely good at what they do, who will say, and have said to me, don't talk to me about Twitter, I'm not interested. And you know what, that's fine, because we can manage that in the comms team, or we can manage that elsewhere, and they don't necessarily need to go to an event and tweet about it. But the payoff is that they are really good at what they do and really recognised in their field, so they can almost get away with not participating in sort of what the rest of us are doing.
Joe, do you?
Yes, well, so we have a mix here. So I came out of a research background. I was writing papers with 40-word titles that had Latin in them, and moved kind of out of that into the communications world. So it's a transition that can happen. With the remainder of our staff, we didn't go out looking really in the research world. We were looking for people whose background was entirely in communications, who had just had some interest and at least some aptitude for picking up the policy pieces or the research pieces. But we don't here at least look at our role really as being sort of engaging in research. We look at our role here as translating the research that other people are already doing. So in some ways, getting another researcher to translate the first set of research is maybe not exactly, maybe not the most efficient way to get where we're trying to be.
Question from the back? And Leonora, do you want to ask yours as well?
Thank you. Shirley Ayres, Connected Care Network. I'll be honest and say my heart sinks at the amount of research reports that are published now that I doubt many people can read. And I'm just wondering whether if researchers were required to demonstrate both the outcomes and the social impact of the reports that they publish, it would be a very helpful way of communicating messages that, quite frankly, are getting lost in an increasingly crowded social sphere.
And my question is, do you think there's parity of status between comms people and researchers in your organisation?
No.
Keith, do you want to go first?
Well, just on the, well, no.
You mean comms people are respected far more?
Of course. On the impact, yeah, we have to do that. We have to demonstrate that more and more, and it's quite difficult. And it's actually, I've noticed over the last maybe 18 months, it's actually becoming quite formulaic as well. So even the extra stuff, even it looks the same. And I've taken them from. As we have associate fellows in different universities in different countries, and it's starting to come together, and just in a way that is generic and not necessarily helpful. It's another sort of box-ticking exercise, but like so many exercises, sort of ticking boxes, they need to be done. It's just part of the rules now. I don't have there's no light at the end of that tunnel, I don't think.
Oh. I was going to be slightly more optimistic. I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Well, there are benefits to it, definitely, but it just feels. Oh.
Yeah, and I don't know if with you guys, if it's so we have a real fun. We have not an issue, but we're our outputs are partly dictated by funders, and if someone commissions research from a think tank, they want the 30-page PDF or 40 or occasionally 50 that 5 people will read if you're lucky. Yeah, and that Google can't find them because they're PDFs. Anyway, so
that doesn't sound too optimistic.
No, I'm getting too optimistic bit. But having said that,
It's realistic though. 5 people reading it.
yeah, and I think one of the good things about being in this digital age is you can tell people only 5 people are reading your report. It doesn't make them feel great. But so here comes the optimistic bit. We've put out some research, partly because we didn't have a funder for it, that was just a blog post. We got as much press coverage from it as we would have, which is what we wanted, as we would have if we'd put out another 80-page PDF. And in doing that, the team could see that the following year, which is this year, we haven't done a research report. We're going to do another blog post or some sort of a short briefing document. And similarly, I'll say this, we put out a Facebook graphic using data that wasn't actually ours, and it got picked up by the Evening Standard as new research from NEF. Just want to stress that it probably says more about journalism than anything else. But things like that, and being able to be a bit nimble and to experiment and to demonstrate the impact you can have without the 40-page PDF, I think we'll start to change things. And for us, it's about those conversations with funders and saying, there are other ways to have impact. But even though I've got a short attention span, I think there are times when it's good to have a well-researched, rigorous document that backs up your theory or idea. So in NEF, I think we have a respected skill set. But I think in an organisation where most people are researchers, research is king.
Joe, how about is it different in the States side?
So not terribly. So we are here at the Century Foundation still kind of at the beginning stages of really trying to more systematically assess the impact of our work. So there has occasionally here been a little bit of a tendency to, we'll put a thing out and we do some, kind of a communication push around that thing. We maybe get a mention in the New York Times, and a couple of external bloggers will write about our report, and then we move on to the next thing and tell ourselves, well, it was in the Times, it must have been successful. So one of the things that our new team has been doing is really kind of putting into place for reports and for events that we conduct, kind of a sort of worksheets that we'll be putting in front of our researchers and saying, look, we need to think up front about what our real goals are, and what some concrete objectives are so that we can, at the end kind of go back and try to do some, try and really assess whether or not we have been effective, and if so, then great, keep doing that, and if not, then kind of rethink the sort of what we're approaching. Again, as I say, I don't have a whole lot that I can give in terms of success stories, as our experiment is still kind of very new at this point. So.
Okay, we've got two questions. Richard, in here in the middle. We'll get to you guys in a minute.
Richard Darlington, Head of News from IPPR. I'll just follow that up. I want to be optimistic, not just because it's Friday and we'll all be in the pub in half an hour. But we are doing that with funders. We are including in research proposals which go to funders suggestions for innovative comms outputs. And we are telling them upfront about it and getting them to fund it. So some of the animations that we've done, which we can't do in-house, which have a cost, we're, if you like, encouraging funders to commission that from us at the start of a research project. What we haven't yet done is manage to persuade them that they don't need a report as well. But we are optimistic. The other thing about publishing on PDFs, so Google can't find stuff, in the new year, we hope to publish on the page in the new IPPR website, watch this space.
Hi, my name is Rob Watt. I'm Director of Communications at Stockholm Environment Institute. Thank you very much for an extremely thought-provoking panel. I think I can beat Carys. We've got 150 words as the sentence. That is nothing to boast about, of course. I listened to what Joe was saying about outcomes. I think that's something that I'd like just to put in here, that think about outcomes in a way that goes beyond just column inches or retweets or that sort of measurement, I think is hugely important. And one thing I've noticed from all of your presentations is the focus on comms expertise and skills. If we're thinking about outputs in terms of changing behaviour, changing policy, is there a role for, if you like, topic expertise within the communications team? In our case, for example, we now have a climate change communications specialist. It's a pretty big field, and it's relatively well defined both in research and in policy. But I wonder whether that's something that you'd like to reflect on. To what extent, beyond reverse mentoring of the researchers, can we bring some sort of, they don't have to be researchers, they don't have to be researchers, but they have to know a little bit more about it to be able to enact the outcome, make the links to policymakers. And is there a role for that in the future of comms teams?
I'm just going to take a couple more and deal with them all together. There's Jeff and Sophie, was it? Yeah. I can do it.
Hi there, Jeff Knezovich from the Institute of Development Studies. My question actually piggybacks quite well on that. I have about 15 different questions, but I'm going to try and narrow as best I can. Just one. There was a really great article in the New Republic a week or two ago about Heritage Action, which was a political wing of the Heritage Foundation, and how the millennial who was in charge of Heritage Action basically brought down the Heritage Foundation, and it's basically made it too political in a way that meant that people in the US could no longer engage with the Heritage Foundation research. And so I guess, I don't know, I am someone who identifies as a millennial, but I'm over 20, I'm no longer in my 20s, so that maybe makes me in the older bit. I'm not sure of this room, but there seems to, I guess the question is, following on his, is there a role for expertise? Is there a role for research? It's seeming like it's very poo-pooed in this environment almost, of the, you need the comm specialisms, but not the topic expertise. And so that was part of the question. The other part of the question was a very practical element to how you organize the jobs. IDS has over 250 staff. ODI was also very large where I worked before. How do you get the watching, how do you know what's going on in an institute of that size when you're in the comms team without any of that sort of topical expertise?
Sophie Jenkinson from Centre for Mental Health, which is a charity think tank in the sort of policy research space. for mental health. I wanted to ask about capacity. So I've worked in 2 sort of editorial comms roles now in quite small think tank spaces where there's just been 2 of us. And so obviously I get what you're saying about all the, researcher being involved. I really obviously agree with you about that. But I think it's partly a sort of upwards problem in that I think we come across this quite a lot in that we aren't making money. We aren't an element that is making money or can actively show that we are. I think that I've got lots of things that I can say about that, but I think I'd just like to know your experience of sort of demonstrating that in terms of like getting more capacity or how you work around having such small capacity.
Okay, perhaps Keith, go to you first on if you've got a lot of specialists or a lot of different research areas, what is the role of specialists? I guess the pros and cons of having a specialist, because I think there are probably arguments on both sides.
Well, the pros of specialists in the comms team.
Yes.
Yeah, because we don't really. We've got 14 or 15 research programs within the 4 departments, covering everything from Asia, Middle East to thematic stuff, security, defence, economics. It's impossible to have pretty much anyone in the comms team who is across. They may have an interest in 1 or 2 of these things, but they're not experts. So the way we deal with it, I suppose, twofold is, 1, it's often devolved to the researcher. So if you've got someone working on Angola, Mozambique, that person needs to be across, for example, the press and build his or her own contacts and just make sure that we should have target media in about 52 countries. And obviously, 2 to 3 people sitting in London cannot be across all of that. So it's absolutely down to the researchers, and some are obviously better than others. If we have a really big publication or report or a project, we are likely to bring in external expertise. So either an agency or just a freelancer who can work with the press office and just steer them, just point us in the right direction, either with the sort of the right tone, the key messages, or the key people. And there are, the way that works is, I guess there are some pros. I guess the con is that a lot of the comms outreach isn't owned by the comms team. But as we're all sort of saying, that's the direction that communications teams are moving in anyway. You can't control what people are doing on social media. You can't control every word that somebody says to a journalist in Angola. So that's a slight loss of centralised control, but that's probably not even a big con.
Carys, maybe on that, or
yeah, I think
the capacity question?
Yeah, there are loads. I wrote lots of notes down. Definitely on the capacity I'll talk about. On specialisms, yes. I think that, again, it's for us, it's, there are 3 of us, so we can't do it. What we do try and do is, one of us tends, that you build up, you have teams that you tend to work with or you'll tend to lead on. So one member of my team always works on fisheries stuff. So when there's some new research on that, he's the obvious person to lead if he has capacity. And I do think it is important to have that depth of knowledge, not least because if you pick up the phone to a journalist, you need to be able to answer their sort of first few questions. So I think, yes, in an ideal world, you want to have that subject knowledge, although I still don't think it's quite the same as being a researcher and having the kind of like really focused mind that wants to delve down. Capacity, yeah. We're slightly lucky because we have paid supporters and because we're a think tank that people engage with sort of as individuals and not necessarily just because they're sort of working on the research organisations. We've got what I'm trying to do to build out the team is to show that we can make money through online donations. So that's and I'm aware that's kind of a lucky place to be in. Otherwise, it's just, I guess, the same way anyone lobbies for anything internally, like trying to show your value, doing deals with other people, spotting where some money might come in and being like, don't you think it should be for a new comms person? I think we really need one. Or starting a litany of, everyone in NEF knows how many more comms people loads of other think tanks have than us. So that's my kind of general, there's only 3 of us. There's about, how many in IPPR, Richard? Comms people. That's how many I say, so that's good. Yeah, I'm always like, well, IPPR have Yeah, IPPR have 6, and they have fewer researchers than us. That's the kind of litany that I tend to maintain. So not an easy answer, but I mean, I don't know. I think there are other think tanks that could experiment with trying to make money online as well. It's an interesting space to be in.
Joe, do you have any comments on either of those 3 questions? Maybe.
Yeah, so in terms of having specialists on our comms team, here at CCF, we cover 6 major areas, and we have 5 people on our communications team. So even if we wanted to have specialists on the team, we'd still end up with some level of gap. I think what helps us to kind of mitigate that some of these worries is that we're sort of our whole space is designed to be very collaborative. So we all sit in a big open office, and I can sit at my desk and look at researchers working in many of the different areas we cover. So it's a pretty easy process to stand up and walk over and bring in researchers when we are concerned that maybe we don't quite get what's most important here, or maybe we're worried about how should we say this way or that way, which one kind of is more precise. So it's I think for us that our very open and kind of collaborative atmosphere helps means that we don't necessarily need to have the specialists sitting or have the research expertise on the comms team. That we work pretty closely with our researchers to before we put things together. And in terms of demonstrating kind of need for capacity, we are lucky here to be mostly funded by way of an endowment. So there's a lot less here of going out and kind of looking for funders or having to justify to funders a need for more staff. So it did give us the kind of the luxury of thinking a bit about what we as an institution would like to accomplish, and then determining our level of funding based on kind of our organizational needs rather than on how much we've been able to get from our funders. And I do realize that's a huge luxury, and most days I'm just really happy not to be out fundraising. So.
There was one question there, and I want to just ask a question on consultancies and how much everyone on the panel thinks that maybe you can give a slightly different view, maybe in general, about how much consultancies are part of the mix of how you staff communications for think tanks versus how much you should have things in-house. And I think the question was about
Thanks. I'm Sam Thomas from the RSA. There seems to be a kind of consensus that having good, agile comms people who are quick on their feet, quick to spot opportunities is a good thing, and I don't think anybody would disagree with that. NEF clearly are really good at it. You get a really good balance between irreverence and sort of serious kind of policy points, but there are other places to do well too. Resolution Foundation, really timely, really good on Twitter, that sort of thing. So clearly it's a good thing. I want to play devil's advocate and say, is there a danger with that, which is that if you have a sort of focus on relentlessly getting stuff out timely, quickly, quick responses, does that undermine the authority that an organisation, for instance, like Chatham House has, where actually what you're doing is weighty, serious work? You want to present it in that way sometimes. It's not always appropriate to take that approach. And as an example, I won't use an example from think tanks because that's pretty dangerous in here, but from journalism, if you look at the Twitter accounts of most broadsheet newspapers, they're completely different in tone and style to the paper. They're usually kind of much more like sort of BuzzFeed, kind of clickbaity type stuff. And that does do something to undermine the respect people have for the brand. If you look at kind of the Telegraph, for instance, it's a very, very different proposition online than it is in paper. So is there any risk when you're kind of thinking about the people you have in your teams, that if you're looking to kind of chase Twitter followers, if you're looking to chase kind of click-throughs, are you worried that that might undermine the impact that the work has when it actually gets through?
Okay, keep the answers quick if possible, because we've reached 5 p.m. But
I think yes, it does, and I think that we've tried to sort of steer a path around that. And actually, I think it's opened up. We've expanded a lot in the last couple of years because I think we've maintained a serious tone and the authority of the research. we definitely need to be using social media and be agile and so on. But we've made that decision, and it's benefited us. But that's possibly because we're more in an international context.
I think it really depends. I think that there is a way to be online and be agile, and with this, which isn't being kind of BuzzFeed, lol, big cat in this picture, kind of. Although that is, I mean, I love cats. That is basically why I'm on the internet. Yeah, so I think you can do it. I think, again, I mean, I do feel really privileged to work at Nixon. It's like a brilliant organisation. You know, part of our brand, part of why we exist is that we want to make things accessible. We have like a clear education. You know, we don't want to be kind of staid and detached. We want everyone to feel like they can engage with economics and engage with economic ideas. That lends itself quite well to, a more accessible brand on social media. I'm just trying to think of people on Twitter who aren't really sort of clickbaity, and come back to me when I've had a drink. I'm sure I'll think of one, but I think it can be done.
Any views quickly before I go on consultancies? Do you use consultancies?
As I said, we do, but for big projects, but we often find they sometimes don't get us. It's like, as I said, we're not out to chase the news. We don't need a headline every single time. There's more kind of subtle things at play, but we do use them, and we've used some good ones.
No.
Well, I used to work at a consultancy, so I'm really wary of them. But no, we used an agency to redevelop our website last year, and that involves some consultancy. We don't really have budget for agencies. We use, for our European work, we use a PR agency to sell in kind of different languages, because we do not have French, German, and Spanish in our skill set. But I think there's definitely a place for them, but I don't think it's unique. I think the rule of thumb is the same with consultancies. There are some really good ones, there are some really bad ones. It normally works if you have a project that's really defined, because then you get best value for money. But it's not true for all.
Do you have a sort of insider's view of
when
we should be using you?
So I'm from a consultancy, and what I would say might surprise you actually, which is, where possible, don't hire us to outsource your comms work. The best value that we can provide is as people that are specialists in monitoring the new trends and how the landscape is changing. Call on us to help you to evolve your culture and the structures and the strategies that you're using, but using that to upskill the people within the organisation. So we'd much rather spend our time training comms people in understanding how to communicate using digital media rather than broadcast media, for example, so that they then become pros and become just as good at it as the people that we have. So use it to take you forward, but I think where possible you need to be building the skills in-house, particularly as things do become much more real-time and much more agile. You don't want that extra kind of link in the chain to getting your message out there. And then just the final point that I would make is just the very nature of digital channels is that, unlike all of the traditional media, which is based on a broadcast model, messages going one way, digital media is a conversation, and so it is going in two directions. And so to answer your point over there, yes, there is a risk that the very kind of formal, authoritative tone of voice that you have in your broadcast communications could appear to be watered down a bit, but if it's a conversation, you need to be talking like a human, otherwise you just sound really weird and not engaging at all. So I think that it's a risk worth playing with, but yeah, doing it carefully and consciously.
And Joe, in 1 minute, did you have any blowback on Game of Thrones?
No, actually. In fact, what I would, I might push even a little farther than that and say that there's sometimes a tendency for us to maybe take ourselves a little too seriously as researchers, and that maybe it doesn't entirely hurt things if we do tone down ever so slightly the seriousness of some of our traditional work. This is not to say that we should be throwing cat pictures into our reports, but I do think that there's probably there probably is a path that is somewhere in between the kind of seriousness of our broadcast work and the sort of more informal tone to our social media presence. again, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is a problem that probably no one has really cracked quite yet. Sort of how we present our serious stuff in a way that really works in a world that is, in some ways, becoming kind of less formal in its ways of communication. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Right. Well, thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to everyone for speaking. This is, as you know, Wonkcomms is still kind of in its early days. We're still trying to look for the ways in which we can support the community. It's all voluntary. It's just Leonora, Rich, and I, and you guys kind of taking on and doing things. We're looking for people to look after the Wonkcomms Twitter account. So if your organisation or you are interested in running that, send us a tweet, a line, whatever, however you want to do it. Do take on. We'll be posting videos of this event online. We've got the blog. If it sparked ideas that you want to write about, do get in contact and think about the blog. We are now going for a drink, so you can have a chat and debrief, and just talk about your work or whatever you want to do. It's at the 2 Chairman, which is not very far away. I think it's just that kind of down towards Trafalgar Square. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.